We need to talk about what just happened in Congress, because folks, this is the moment we've been waiting for. After years of redactions, after years of black bars covering up names, after years of the Department of Justice protecting the powerful, finally, someone had the courage to say the names out loud. Congressman Ro Khanna stood up on the floor of the House of Representatives and named names. 6 names. 6 people whose identities have been hidden, whose connections to Jeffrey Epstein have been buried in classified DOJ files, whose participation in or knowledge of one of the most horrific criminal networks in modern history has been protected by our own justice system. Let me tell you who these people are, because the mainstream media isn't going to give you the full story. They're going to gloss over this. They're going to downplay it. They're going to find reasons why it's not that important. But I'm going to tell you everything. First name, Leslie Wexner. Now, if you don't know who Leslie Wexner is, let me educate you. He's a billionaire. Not just wealthy, a billionaire. He was the CEO of L Brands, the company that owned Victoria's Secret, one of the most successful retail executives in American history. Forbes estimated his net worth at over $7 billion, and he had an extremely close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Wexner gave Epstein power of attorney over his finances. Think about that. A billionaire gave a guy who wasn't even a licensed financial advisor complete control over his money. Epstein managed Wexner's fortune. He had access to everything. He even had access to Wexner's properties, including the Manhattan townhouse that later became infamous as one of the locations where abuse occurred. Now, Wexner has claimed he was a victim, that Epstein stole from him, that he didn't know what Epstein was really doing, and maybe that's true. Maybe one of the savviest businessmen in America was completely fooled by Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe he had no idea what was happening in his own townhouse. But here's what we know for certain. Epstein operated for years with Wexner's money, Wexner's properties, and Wexner's connections. Whether Wexner knew exactly what was happening or not, his resources enabled Epstein's operation, and that's been buried in DOJ files until now. Second name, Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem. He's the CEO of DP World, a massive port operator based in the United Arab Emirates. This is a man with significant power and influence in international shipping and logistics. And according to the information that's now coming out, there's a video of torture that bin Sulayem allegedly sent to Epstein. Let me repeat that because I want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about here. A video of torture sent to Jeffrey Epstein by a high-ranking official from the UAE. What was in that video? Who was being tortured? Why was it sent to Epstein? These are questions that desperately need answers. But until Khanna named this name on the floor of Congress, bin Sulayem was protected. His identity was redacted. The American people weren't allowed to know that someone connected to our ally, the United Arab Emirates, someone with massive business interests around the world, was in Epstein's files and allegedly sending him videos of torture. Third name, Nicola Caputo, an Italian politician. Now, we don't know as much about Caputo's specific connections yet, but think about what it means that an Italian politician's name was being protected by the U.S. Department of Justice. Why? Why is the DOJ redacting the names of foreign politicians? Who are they protecting and why? Fourth name, Salvatore Nurara. Get this, a former New York Police Department detective. Let that sink in. A cop. Someone who was supposed to be protecting people. Someone who was supposed to be investigating crimes. Someone who wore a badge and carried a gun with the authority of the state, and his name is in the Epstein files. What was Nurara's connection to Epstein? What did he know? What did he do? And most importantly, was he using his position as a law enforcement officer to protect Epstein's operation? Was he providing intelligence? Was he tipping Epstein off about investigations? Was he using police databases to help Epstein find victims or intimidate witnesses? These are terrifying questions. Because if law enforcement was compromised, if cops were part of the network, that explains a lot about why Epstein got away with it for so long. That explains why investigations went nowhere. That explains why victims weren't believed. That explains why the whole system seemed designed to protect Epstein instead of stopping him. Fifth and sixth names: Zorab Mikoladze and Leonik Leonov. We don't know much about these two yet. The information is still coming out. But their names were important enough that the DOJ felt the need to redact them. Their connections were significant enough that someone decided the American people couldn't be allowed to know about them. Until now. Until Ro Khanna stood up and said their names out loud. And you know what makes this possible? You know why Khanna could name these names without being sued into oblivion? Congressional immunity. When a member of Congress speaks on the floor of the House or Senate, they're protected. They can't be sued for libel or slander for what they say in an official capacity. It's a critical protection designed to allow our representatives to speak truth without fear of retaliation. And that protection is exactly why victims couldn't name these names themselves. Because if a survivor of Epstein's abuse stood up and said, Leslie Wexner enabled this, or Sultan bin Sulayem was part of this network, they would be destroyed. They would be buried in lawsuits. These are billionaires and foreign officials with unlimited resources and the best lawyers money can buy. A victim naming names would face defamation lawsuits that would bankrupt them, that would consume years of their life, that would re-traumatize them over and over again. Even if they're telling the truth, even if they have evidence, the legal process itself becomes a weapon to silence them. But Khanna is protected, and he used that protection to do what victims couldn't do themselves: force these names into the public record. Now, let me tell you how we got here, because this didn't just happen spontaneously. This was the result of a pressure campaign. Congressman Ro Khanna, Congressman Thomas Massie, and yes, even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who a lot of people love to mock and dismiss, they worked together to force the Department of Justice's hand. They demanded access to the unredacted files. They insisted on seeing the real documents, not the blacked-out versions the public gets. They reviewed the evidence, and then they realized something. The redactions weren't protecting national security. They weren't protecting ongoing investigations. They were protecting powerful people from embarrassment and legal consequences. So they went public. They held hearings. They gave speeches. They put pressure on the DOJ. And eventually, the DOJ admitted there were errors in the redaction process. Errors. That's what they called it. Not a cover-up, not a deliberate attempt to hide names, just errors. But you know what those errors resulted in? The names I just told you about remaining hidden. Wexner, bin Sulayem, Caputo, Nurara, Mikoladze, Leonov. All of them protected by errors in the redaction process. And it's not just Khanna who's been sounding the alarm. Other members of Congress have now reviewed those unredacted files, and their reactions tell you everything you need to know about what's in there. Lauren Boebert, Congresswoman from Colorado, she reviewed the files. And her reaction? She was furious. She came out and said that Ghislaine Maxwell, who's currently serving 20 years in federal prison, deserves far harsher punishment. Think about that. Maxwell is already serving 2 decades. And Boebert's position after reading the files is, that's not enough. What did she see in those files? What evidence is there that convinced her Maxwell's crimes were even worse than what she was convicted of? And more importantly, who else was implicated that hasn't been charged at all? Senator Cynthia Lummis had an even more striking reaction. She's a Republican from Wyoming, generally pretty measured in her public statements. And she admitted that before reading the files, she hadn't really paid attention to the Epstein case. She thought it was overblown, probably just media hype, conspiracy theories, nothing to really worry about. And then she read the unredacted files, and she completely changed her mind. She realized the scale of what happened. She understood why this matters. She saw the evidence of how extensive this network was, how many people were involved, how many victims there were. If a sitting U.S. senator can admit she was wrong, can admit she underestimated the severity of this, what does that tell you about what's actually in those files? These aren't left-wing activists looking for reasons to attack powerful people. These are members of Congress from both parties who reviewed the evidence and came away horrified by what they saw. They're demanding action. They're demanding accountability. They're demanding that the full truth come out. But here's the problem. Even with this pressure, even with members of Congress naming names, even with public outrage, the system is still protecting most of the people involved. 6 names. Khanna named 6 names. But how many names are in those files total? Dozens? Hundreds? We know from earlier reports that Trump's name appears thousands of times. We know there are flight logs with dozens of passengers. We know there are financial records showing payments to and from numerous individuals. We know there are emails, phone records, calendar entries, all documenting a vast network of people who were connected to Epstein. 6 names is a start, but it's only a start. And the fact that it took years of pressure campaigns, congressional hearings, and finally a member of Congress using his immunity to speak publicly just to get 6 names out, tells you how protected this network is. Let me talk about Leslie Wexner specifically for a moment because his story really illustrates how this whole system worked. Wexner was one of the most powerful men in retail. He built an empire. He had access to models, to young women who wanted to work in fashion, to aspiring Victoria's Secret angels. And he gave Jeffrey Epstein, who nobody had ever heard of, who had no apparent qualifications, access to all of that. Epstein used Wexner's name, Wexner's money, Wexner's properties, and Wexner's connections. He told young women he was recruiting for Victoria's Secret. He used the promise of modeling careers as bait. He operated out of Wexner's Manhattan townhouse. And Wexner claims he had no idea. He claims Epstein fooled him, stole from him, betrayed his trust. But he also gave Epstein complete power of attorney. He allowed Epstein to make decisions about his properties, his finances, his businesses, without oversight. Does that sound like someone who was kept in the dark? Or does it sound like someone who was providing cover for an operation he knew about but didn't want to be directly connected to? I'm not saying I know the answer to that question. I'm saying it's a question that deserves to be asked, investigated, and answered. But until Khanna named Wexner on the floor of Congress, that question wasn't even being asked publicly because his name was redacted. The same applies to Sultan bin Sulayem. He's running one of the world's largest port operations. He has business interests across the globe. He's connected to a government that the United States maintains diplomatic and economic relations with. And he allegedly sent torture videos to Epstein. That's not a minor detail. That's not irrelevant information. That's evidence of deeply disturbing behavior by someone in a position of significant power. But it was hidden. The DOJ redacted his name. The American people weren't allowed to know. Why? Who made that decision? Who decided that protecting Sultan bin Sulayem's reputation was more important than transparency about an international sex trafficking network? And Salvatore Nurara, the former NYPD detective, this one might be the most important because it speaks to how Epstein operated with such impunity for so long. If you have a cop on your payroll, or even just a cop who's compromised and looking the other way, you have enormous advantages. You know when investigations are happening. You know what evidence is being gathered. You know who's talking to police. You can intimidate witnesses. You can make evidence disappear. You can ensure that complaints go nowhere. Epstein was arrested in 2006 in Palm Beach. That investigation could have ended everything right there. But instead, he got a sweetheart plea deal and served 13 months in a county jail where he was allowed to leave during the day. That investigation was compromised from the start. Was Nurara involved in that? Was he involved in protecting Epstein during earlier investigations? We don't know because nobody's investigated him. His name was redacted until now. This is the pattern. Every time you look closely at how Epstein got away with it for so long, you find someone in a position of authority who should have stopped him but didn't. Prosecutors who gave him lenient deals. Police who didn't pursue investigations. Lawyers who helped him intimidate victims. Businessmen who gave him money and access. Politicians who took his donations and attended his parties. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was a system. A network of people who either participated in the abuse, enabled it, or looked the other way because they were getting something in return. Money, access, blackmail material, or just the knowledge that if they went along, they'd be protected too. And that system is still protecting itself. The DOJ is still redacting names. Law firms are still being threatened into silence. Victims are still being ignored. And it took a congressman using parliamentary immunity just to get 6 names out into the public. Think about what that means. In America in 2026, with all our talk about transparency and rule of law and justice, we have a system where the truth about a sex trafficking network that operated for decades can only come out when a member of Congress invokes special legal protections to speak it. That's not justice. That's a cover-up that's been partially exposed, but only partially. There are still names being hidden. There are still people being protected. There are still victims who haven't gotten justice. Ro Khanna did the right thing. Thomas Massie did the right thing. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who people love to hate, did the right thing on this. They used their power, their access, their platform to force some truth into the public record. But 6 names out of how many? 6 names when we know the network was vast? 6 names when we know there are flight logs with dozens of passengers? When we know there are financial records documenting hundreds of transactions? When we know there are thousands of pages of documents? This is a start, but it's nowhere near the end. And unless the American people demand more, unless we refuse to let this story fade away, unless we hold the Department of Justice accountable for their errors in redaction, this is where it will stop. 6 names, a few headlines, some outrage on social media, and then everyone moves on to the next scandal while the rest of the network remains protected. That can't happen. We can't let it happen. Because every name that stays redacted is someone who got away with it. Every name that stays hidden is someone who enabled abuse and faced no consequences. Every name that the DOJ protects is a failure of justice. The victims deserve better. The truth deserves to come out. And the American people deserve to know who was part of this network, what they did, and why our own government has been working so hard to protect them. Ro Khanna gave us 6 names. Now we need to demand the rest.